When a user interacts with your Laravel application, every action they perform begins with an incoming request. This request can be something simple like typing a URL into the browser, such as myapp.com/home, or it may come from a form submission, or even from JavaScript code sending data through Fetch or Axios. No matter where the request comes from, the very first question it asks your application is always the same: where should I go? Laravel answers this question through its routing system. Routes act like the main entrance or gateway to every feature inside your application. They define how your app should respond when a specific URL is visited, or when a particular HTTP method like GET, POST, PUT, or DELETE is used. The moment a request hits your server, Laravel checks the routes file to see which path matches the incoming request. As soon as a matching route is found, Laravel directs the request to the correct destination. In most cases, this destination is a controller. A controller works like a traffic manager, containing the logic of what your application should do next. For example, if the route points to the home controller and its index function, Laravel sends the request into that function, allowing it to process data, interact with the database, or prepare information before sending a response back to the user. Sometimes routes directly show a view without a controller, but for most structured applications, controllers handle all the processing. Behind the scenes, controllers may communicate with models, and models act as the bridge between your application and the database. Models use Laravel's eloquent ORM to read, write, update, or delete data, making database operations smooth and expressive without requiring manually written SQL. When a controller needs data, it simply asks the model, and the model fetches everything from the database in a clean and organized way. Once the required logic and data handling are complete, Laravel prepares the final output that the user should see. This output is usually sent to a view. Views are blade templates that control how information appears on the screen. They generate the HTML, CSS, or UI elements that make up the visual part of your application. In other words, the controller handles the brain work, the model handles the data work, and the view handles the presentation work. After the view is rendered, it is returned back through the route system as a complete response. And finally, the user sees the finished result in their browser. This smooth flow from the incoming request, through the route, into the controller, across the model, and finally out through the view is what makes Laravel's architecture clean, efficient, and beautifully organized. The routing system is the heart of this entire process, acting as the main doorway that connects every piece of the application together.
In Laravel, routing acts as the intelligent decision maker that determines exactly how every incoming request should be handled, and the image represents this process like a high-tech traffic control system. Whenever a user types a URL, such as example.com/profile, Laravel treats this as an incoming request that immediately asks the framework a simple but critical question: who should take care of this? This request may come from many different sources, such as a browser on a mobile device, an automated API client, or even JavaScript running inside a web page using Fetch or Axios. Regardless of where the request originates, it always enters the same gateway, the Laravel routing system. Once the request reaches this routing layer, Laravel examines two things: the URL being accessed and the HTTP method being used, whether it's GET, POST, PUT, or DELETE. These two details allow Laravel to match the request to the correct route definition inside the routes file. When a matching route is found, Laravel knows exactly what should happen next. If the route points toward a controller, the request is handed off to the appropriate function inside that controller, where server-side logic is executed. This could involve validating data, interacting with the database, applying business rules, or performing calculations. After the controller finishes its work, it decides how the final response should be returned. If the request is meant for a web page, Laravel sends the result to a blade view, where the UI is rendered and delivered back to the browser. In this case, the user sees a fully formatted web page generated from templates and dynamic data. On the other hand, if the request is from an API or an external system, the controller often returns a JSON response containing structured data such as status messages, success indicators, or requested information. This JSON output is clean, lightweight, and easy for machines to understand, making it perfect for mobile apps, third-party services, or JavaScript-based applications. The entire process highlights one important truth. Without routes, the application becomes unreachable because Laravel would have no instructions on how to respond or where to direct incoming traffic. Routes serve as the master map that connects URLs, controllers, views, and APIs together into one unified flow. They ensure every request reaches the correct destination smoothly and efficiently, allowing the framework to deliver the right response every single time.
In Laravel, routing becomes even more powerful when you understand the separation between web routes and API routes. And the image visualizes this difference like two separate highways inside the same application. When normal web users visit a browser-based page such as example.com/dashboard, their request travels through the web traffic flow, which is handled by the web.php file. This file is designed specifically for traditional web interactions, meaning it uses sessions, cookies, CSRF protection, and blade views. Because of this, every request that passes through web.php carries information about the user's login state, the browser session, and all the features needed to render a complete user interface. Laravel bundles all of these features automatically under the web middleware group, ensuring the user experience feels smooth, secure, and interactive. On the other side of the system, you have the api.php file, responsible for handling requests such as example.com/api/users, typically coming from mobile applications, JavaScript frontends, or external services. These requests do not need sessions or browser features. Instead, they focus on speed, statelessness, and lightweight communication through JSON. Because APIs are meant to be fast and independent, they do not use CSRF protection, sessions, or blade views. Instead, they use tokens or headers to verify identity and return clean JSON responses that can be understood by automated systems and applications. The Laravel project organizes both of these routing behaviors inside the routes folder, where web.php and api.php serve as two different rulebooks for two different types of traffic. A route defined in web.php may instruct Laravel to load a controller method and return a beautifully rendered blade template, while a route defined in api.php may simply return a list of users in JSON format using Eloquent. This separation keeps your application clean, structured, and optimized for performance. The key differences shown in the image highlight how web routing supports session-based authentication, CSRF protection, browser interfaces, and blade templates, while API routing remains stateless without CSRF and dedicated to JSON communication suitable for mobile apps and JavaScript frameworks. Both systems work together inside the same Laravel project, but each one is optimized for its own kind of traffic, ensuring that the overall application remains fast, secure, and easy to manage. In Laravel, the web.php file plays a crucial role in handling everything related to browser-based web pages, and the image demonstrates this by showing how every part of a traditional website passes through this routing file. Whenever a user opens a home page, logs into an account, visits an admin panel, submits a contact form, or views their dashboard, the browser sends a request directly into the web.php routes. These routes are designed specifically for full web pages that rely on HTML templates, interactive user sessions, browser cookies, and strong protection for form submissions. Because web interfaces require a user-friendly experience, Laravel wraps all routes inside web.php with special middleware that automatically manages sessions, remembers logged-in users, handles cookies, and protects forms using CSRF tokens. This means that when a user navigates through your website, Laravel keeps track of who they are, what pages they visited, and whether they are authenticated, all while ensuring the communication remains secure. As the request flows through the web.php route, Laravel sends it to the appropriate controller where all backend logic is executed, such as loading user data, processing inputs, or preparing information for display. After the controller completes its work, it passes everything to a blade view, which generates a clean, full HTML page ready to be shown on the browser. The final output becomes a styled, interactive web page that the user can read, click, and navigate through. This entire flow from the browser request into the route through the controller into the blade view and back out as an HTML response happens seamlessly inside Laravel's organized structure. The image also highlights a simple route example that returns a dashboard view, demonstrating how easy it is to define web pages using web.php. In short, web.php handles every browser-facing part of your application by combining sessions, cookies, blade views, and CSRF protection, making it the core foundation for all traditional website pages built with Laravel.
In Laravel, the api.php file serves as the dedicated routing system for stateless API communication, and the image demonstrates how it operates like a centralized data hub specifically built for mobile apps, JavaScript frontends, and external services. Unlike web.php, which focuses on full HTML pages and browser sessions, the api.php routes return pure raw data, usually in JSON format, making them ideal for modern applications such as React, Vue, mobile apps, or any system that needs to send and receive structured information quickly. These routes do not return blade views and do not involve traditional web templates because API consumers do not need visual pages. They only need clean data. This separation creates a powerful level of flexibility, allowing your Laravel backend to communicate with multiple platforms at the same time, whether it's a phone app retrieving user details, a front-end framework fetching product lists, or a third-party service interacting with your application through secure endpoints. A major principle shown in the image is statelessness, which means every request sent to api.php is treated as a completely independent interaction with no memory of previous requests. While web.php relies on cookies and sessions to keep track of authenticated users, api.php replaces this with tokens or API keys. Because of this stateless approach, Laravel does not store session information, does not use cookies, and does not require CSRF protection for API routes. Each request must carry its own authentication token, and once the response is returned, nothing is stored. This pattern makes the system faster, lighter, and far easier to scale across multiple servers. The request flow shown in the image reflects this beautifully. A client application sends an HTTP request, which reaches an api.php route, then passes into a controller, and finally returns a JSON response containing structured data. This flow ensures that the communication is efficient and predictable, whether you're returning a list of products, validating data, or interacting with third-party APIs. An example route in the image shows how simple it can be to return JSON directly from api.php, with Laravel automatically formatting the output into clean, readable data. Overall, api.php is designed for speed, efficiency, and modern application integration. It provides fast responses, avoids unnecessary overhead, and often works with Synctum or API tokens to securely authenticate clients. Because it does not rely on sessions or cookies, it is perfect for distributed systems, cloud-native apps, and services that need consistent communication across multiple platforms. With this structure, Laravel makes it easy to build powerful APIs that can serve everything from mobile apps to complex integrations, all while keeping the backend organized and scalable.
When a user types a URL like yourwebsite.com/about into their browser, Laravel begins a clear and structured process to determine exactly how that request should be handled. And the image illustrates this journey with a smooth visual flow. As soon as the user presses enter, the browser sends a GET request to your server, and Laravel immediately receives it at the application entry point. From here, Laravel's routing system begins scanning the web.php file, which contains all route definitions for browser-based pages. It moves through each route line by line, checking whether any defined path matches the incoming URL. When it encounters the route labeled /about, Laravel recognizes that the incoming request matches this route definition, and at that moment, it effectively declares, Laravel found the matching route. Once the correct match is identified, the request is passed into the connected controller method, such as the indexed function inside the about controller. This controller is responsible for preparing the logic behind the page, gathering data if needed, and then sending it to the appropriate Blade view template. The Blade view, in turn, constructs a full HTML page that represents the About page visually. Finally, Laravel returns this completed HTML response back to the browser, allowing the user to see a fully rendered page on their screen without realizing how many steps happen behind the scenes. This entire process demonstrates why web.php routes are perfect for handling browser interactions. They rely on sessions to remember user information, use cookies for small pieces of stored data, include CSRF protection for secure form submissions, and return complete HTML pages to the user through Blade templates. With every browser request, Laravel silently repeats this routine. Receive the URL, search the web.php file for a matching route, run the controller logic, load the Blade view, and deliver a finished web page back to the user. This seamless behavior is what makes Laravel's routing system both powerful and intuitive for building dynamic, secure, and user-friendly websites.
In Laravel, every route inside the web.php file follows a structured pattern, and the image breaks this down into a simple flow that shows how a route transforms from a written line of code into a fully rendered web page. When you define a route like route get/about, Laravel immediately recognizes three essential parts: the HTTP method, the URL path, and the action to perform. The HTTP method, such as get, tells Laravel what type of request this route responds to. The URL, or path, specifies what the user will type in their browser, like /about, and the action tells Laravel what to do next, such as loading a Blade view or running a controller method. When a user actually visits this URL in their browser, Laravel's routing engine goes to work. Before it even executes the route, Laravel passes the request through the web middleware group, which includes crucial browser-focused features like starting the session, verifying the CSRF token for secure forms, sharing the session with Blade templates, and encrypting cookies to keep user data safe. This middleware is what allows users to stay logged in, submit safe forms, and interact with the website in a personalized and secure way. After passing through middleware, Laravel processes the route definition and performs the action described in it. If the route returns a Blade view, Laravel loads the corresponding about.blade.php file, fills it with any required data, and renders it into a complete HTML page. That final HTML output is then sent back to the user's browser, where it appears as a fully styled and interactive web page. This entire flow makes web.php ideal for full-page HTML experiences, full-site layouts, navigation menus, UI components, form submissions, validation messages, and anything related to session-based features like login dashboards or personalized user areas. Laravel ensures that every web route not only loads the correct page, but also maintains security, manages sessions, and delivers a complete user interface. That is why the image concludes with the reminder that web.php routes are designed specifically for browser-based pages with sessions, CSRF protection, cookies, and full Blade views, making them the foundation of traditional web applications built with Laravel.
In Laravel, the web.php file begins very simply, and many beginners start by defining small route closures directly inside it. For example, a route like route get/welcome that immediately returns a Blade view is easy to understand and works well for simple pages. However, as an application grows and the number of features increases, placing logic directly inside routes quickly becomes messy. The code becomes cluttered, repetitive, and difficult to maintain. This is why Laravel encourages developers to shift from simple closure-based routes to a more structured and scalable approach using controllers. Instead of returning the view directly inside the route now points to a controller action, such as the about method inside the page controller. This keeps the routing file clean and focused only on defining URLs and HTTP methods while moving the actual logic into dedicated controller classes.
Inside a controller, methods can perform tasks like processing data, validating inputs, retrieving information from the database, and finally returning the proper blade view. This separation transforms the entire application into a clear MVC flow, where the route handles navigation, the controller handles logic, and the view handles the user interface. Laravel promotes this structure because it leads to clean, organized, and professional code. Controllers make it easier to reuse logic across different routes, avoid duplication, and group related functions together in one place. This becomes especially important as projects scale, because controllers allow your application to grow without losing structure or becoming difficult to manage. The image shows this transition beautifully, starting from simple closures, moving into controller-based architecture, and finally achieving a clean MVC pipeline where each part has a dedicated responsibility. Laravel's design makes it possible to build small apps quickly while still providing the structure necessary to support large and complex applications. That is why the image concludes by emphasizing that web.php may start simple, but controllers eventually become the clean, scalable, and recommended way to handle logic before passing data into blade views.
When a user interacts with your website and sends a request through their browser, Laravel begins working behind the scenes to determine what should happen next, and the image breaks down this process as a series of intelligent steps. The moment the request reaches your Laravel application, the framework immediately checks the web.php file to find a matching route. Each route inside web.php is defined using three essential components: the HTTP method, such as get or post, the URL path, like /about, and the action that tells Laravel which controller method or view to load. As soon as Laravel finds the matching route, the request passes through an important middleware layer. This layer activates the session system, making it possible for Laravel to remember logged-in users, share session data with blade views, and verify CSRF tokens to protect form submissions from unauthorized attacks. All these middleware steps happen automatically and transparently, ensuring the request is safe, authenticated, and ready to continue. Once the middleware layer completes its work, the request moves into the controller integration stage, where most of the actual logic takes place. Controllers act like the brain of the application, taking responsibility for processing data, applying business rules, validating inputs, and communicating with the database when necessary. The controller then prepares the final information and returns a blade view, which transforms the data into a full HTML page for the user to see. This separation keeps the routing file clean because web.php only defines how URLs connect to controllers, while the controllers themselves handle the deeper logic. Laravel encourages this structure because it results in clean code, easy scalability, and an organized flow that becomes especially important when building forms, dashboards, or complete web pages. That is why best practices emphasize keeping web.php simple, using controllers for logic, and letting Blade handle the final UI. Together, these layers create a smooth and secure behind-the-scenes process that powers every browser-based request in a Laravel application.
When a user visits a page like /about in their browser, Laravel begins a detailed behind-the-scenes process to determine how that request should be handled, and this image visualizes that entire journey step by step. The request first enters Laravel's kernel, which acts as the core engine responsible for handling incoming traffic. Laravel then immediately checks the web.php file to search for a matching route definition. Each route inside this file consists of three core elements: the HTTP method, such as get or post, the URL path, like /about, and the action that tells Laravel which controller method or blade view should be executed. Once Laravel finds the matching route, the request is passed through the web middleware layer, where important browser-focused features come into play. This includes starting the user session, sharing session data with Blade templates, verifying CSRF tokens to protect form submissions, and encrypting cookies for security. These middleware operations happen automatically and ensure that the request remains authenticated, secure, and consistent with the user's browsing session. After the middleware layer finishes its work, Laravel forwards the request to the appropriate controller, which contains the logic for generating the page's content. The controller may interact with a model to fetch data from the database, apply business rules, or validate incoming information.
Once the controller has prepared everything, it returns a blade view file that structures the UI for the browser. Laravel then compiles this blade template into full HTML and sends it back as a clean response to the user's browser, displaying the page exactly as expected. The image also highlights why named routes are so valuable. By assigning a name to a route, such as about.page, Laravel allows you to reference that route throughout your application using route helpers instead of manually typing URLs. This means that if you ever change the URL path in web.php, every reference to that named route, whether in controllers, redirects, or blade templates, updates automatically. This improves maintainability and prevents broken links as the application grows. Together, the routing process, middleware operations, controller integration, and the use of named routes create a highly organized and flexible system. Laravel encourages keeping web.php clean, using controllers for logic, and relying on named routes for long-term maintainability. This makes it ideal for building full HTML pages, form-driven interfaces, and complex dashboards where session state, security, and structure are essential. It is a seamless, behind-the-scenes workflow that powers every browser request in a Laravel application.
In Laravel, dynamic URLs allow your web application to respond to pages that change based on the user's request. And this image illustrates how Laravel's route parameters turn static pages into flexible, data-driven routes. Instead of relying only on fixed paths like /about, dynamic routes use placeholders such as /posts/id or /posts/slug, enabling the application to load different content depending on the value passed in the URL. For example, when a user visits example.com/posts/10, Laravel recognizes that the 10 in the URL represents the ID of a specific post. Behind the scenes, the request enters Laravel's routing system, and web.php looks for a route that matches this pattern. When it finds a route defined as /posts/id, Laravel extracts the actual value from the URL, in this case id equals 10, and automatically passes it into the controller method assigned to handle that route. The controller then uses this value, whether it's a number like 10 or a slug like my first article, to fetch the correct record from the database and prepare the corresponding page. Laravel's automatic parameter injection makes this process smooth, allowing controller functions to simply define a parameter like $ID or $slug and instantly receive the correct value from the URL. The image also highlights how this system works step by step. The browser sends the request, Laravel identifies the matching dynamic route in web.php, extracts the parameter, sends it into the appropriate controller method, and finally returns a rendered response to the user. This process enables the creation of dynamic pages, such as blog posts, product details, user profiles, and dashboard items, all using clean and readable URLs. Laravel's routing engine can even handle optional or multiple parameters, making paths like /users/id/section or /products/id ? Easy to implement. This flexibility allows developers to design intuitive and SEO-friendly URLs without writing repetitive logic. By defining route parameters and letting Laravel inject their values automatically, your application becomes more scalable and easier to maintain.
In Laravel, route parameters, optional parameters, and constraints give you powerful control over how URLs behave, and the image shows how these features work together to create clean, flexible, and reliable routing. Required parameters are the foundation of dynamic routing, letting you define paths like /users/id, where the URL must include a value for the route to match. If the user visits /users without an ID, Laravel rejects the request because the route expects a value. But if they visit /users/25, the routing system extracts the number 25 and passes it directly into the controller method responsible for showing that user's information. Optional parameters work differently. When a route uses a question mark, such as /products/category ? The parameter becomes optional, allowing the route to match both /products, which might show all products by default, and /product/electronics, where Laravel automatically extracts the word electronics and passes it into the controller. These optional values allow developers to design flexible and intuitive URL structures that behave correctly even when users don't supply extra details. Laravel's route constraints add another layer of control by enforcing rules on parameter values before they ever reach the controller. A route like /orders/id can be restricted to numeric-only values using a constraint pattern, ensuring that something like /orders/45 is valid, but /orders/abc is immediately rejected. Laravel supports many powerful constraint types, from simple number rules to complex slug patterns and even UUID validation, helping developers guarantee that incoming URLs follow the correct format. This not only strengthens security, but also ensures the controller receives clean, predictable data. The image shows how this entire process flows step by step. The user enters a URL, Laravel checks the web.php file for a matching route definition, extracts the parameter, validates it against constraints, and finally passes it into the controller method. The result is displayed as a clean, fully rendered page using Blade. With this system, developers can create human-readable, SEO-friendly URLs like /blog/Laravel routing explained, which improve search engine visibility and offer a better user experience. Ultimately, route parameters and constraints give Laravel the flexibility to power blogs, product pages, dashboards, user profiles, and countless other dynamic features while maintaining clean code and strong validation before executing any controller logic.
In Laravel, API routes are handled differently from browser-based routes. In this image explains how the framework automatically organizes them using the special API prefix. While web.php routes deal with sessions, cookies, and full HTML pages, the api.php file is reserved for modern, stateless, data-driven communication. Laravel automatically adds /API in front of every route defined inside api.php. So even if you write a simple route like route get /users, Laravel will transform it behind the scenes into yourwebsite.com/API/users. This automatic prefixing keeps API routes neatly separated from web routes, preventing accidental overlaps and ensuring that your application maintains a clear and predictable structure. As a result, URLs like /users in web.php and /users in api.php can exist simultaneously without conflict because Laravel distinguishes them using the prefix. This creates a clean namespace dedicated exclusively to APIs, making it easier for developers to maintain large applications where both web pages and API endpoints coexist. Once a request enters the API layer, Laravel processes it using stateless middleware designed for speed and simplicity. Unlike web routes, API routes do not rely on sessions, do not use cookies, and do not require CSRF protection. Every request stands alone, containing all the information needed to authenticate and authorize itself, often through tokens or headers. This stateless behavior results in faster and lightweight request handling, making API routes ideal for mobile apps, React or Vue frontends, and external services that expect JSON responses. The request flow is straightforward. The client sends a request to a URL beginning with /API. Laravel applies stateless middleware, forwards the request to the appropriate controller method, and returns a JSON response. Although the syntax for defining routes in web.php and api.php may look nearly identical, their behavior is fundamentally different because of the surrounding middleware and the automatic prefixing. Web routes return full blade views suited for human interaction, while API routes respond with structured JSON designed for machine-to-machine communication. Together, this separation creates a cleaner architecture, clearer boundaries, and a more reliable application structure, especially as your system grows to support both web pages and API services.
In Laravel's API ecosystem, middleware plays a crucial role in controlling how stateless requests are processed, and his image clearly shows how Laravel keeps API traffic lightweight, secure, and predictable. Unlike browser-based routes in web.php, which use sessions and cookies to remember users between requests, API routes inside api.php operate in a stateless environment. This means that every request arrives completely independent of the previous one.
The server does not store session information, does not manage login cookies, and does not remember who the user is. Instead, each API request must include everything the server needs to validate and process it, such as tokens, headers, parameters, or a JWT. Because the server does not hold state, API endpoints become faster, more scalable, and easier to distribute across multiple servers or cloud environments. Whenever a client, such as a mobile app, SPA, or third-party service, sends a request to an API endpoint, Laravel runs it through the API gateway and immediately checks for a valid token or header before allowing it to move forward. Once the request reaches Laravel's API middleware stack, the system applies specialized middleware designed only for api.php. This includes the throttle API middleware, which enforces rate limiting to prevent abuse by restricting how many requests a client can send per minute. If a user exceeds this limit, Laravel automatically returns a 429 too many requests response, protecting your server from overload or malicious traffic. Other middleware in the stack validates the token or headers to ensure the client is authorized and formats the final JSON response so the output is clean, structured, and machine-readable. The request then moves into the controller, where logic is executed and the correct JSON data is prepared and returned. This stateless pipeline ensures consistent behavior every time. A request enters through the API layer, gets checked for authentication, is throttled if necessary, passes through the controller, and exits as a JSON response. Stateless architecture combined with rate limiting creates an environment that is both highly efficient and highly secure. Performance improves because the server does not waste time managing sessions. Security is strengthened because every request must prove itself with a token. Scalability increases because stateless requests can be distributed across multiple servers or containers without coordination. And predictability rises because the server treats every request exactly the same, with no hidden session data influencing behavior. This combination makes Laravel's API layer ideal for modern applications, such as mobile apps, React or Vue SPAs, IoT devices, and third-party integrations that depend on reliable, fast, and secure JSON-based communication.
In Laravel, handling stateless API requests becomes especially important when dealing with login systems for mobile apps, SPAs, or any service that communicates through JSON rather than traditional web sessions, and this image demonstrates exactly how that process works behind the scenes. Unlike web.php, which uses cookies and session storage to remember logged-in users, api.php operates in a stateless environment where every request stands alone. This means that the server does not keep track of who the user is. Instead, each request must carry all the required information, including credentials, tokens, or headers. When a mobile app or SPA sends a login request, it packages the user's email and password into a JSON payload and sends it to an API route such as /API/login. Because this route belongs to api.php, Laravel automatically applies the stateless API middleware group, which avoids session-based behavior and prepares the system for token-based authentication. As soon as the request reaches the controller, Laravel begins validating the input, checking the database for the user, and verifying the credentials. If everything is correct, the controller generates an authentication token, often through JWT or Laravel Sanctum, and returns it as part of a JSON response. This token becomes the user's identity for all future API requests. Since API routes do not store sessions or cookies, the client must include the token with every request using an authorization header. The server then verifies the token before allowing access to any protected route. This cycle continues consistently. Each request includes a token, Laravel checks it, processes the controller logic, and returns another JSON response. This stateless pattern is what makes API authentication predictable, secure, and perfectly suited for distributed systems where multiple servers may handle requests. The image also highlights why JSON is the standard communication format in this system. JSON is lightweight, extremely fast for machines to parse, and universally supported across mobile apps, SPAs, backend systems, IoT devices, and third-party integrations. It is also perfectly aligned with stateless architecture because it can carry all required information without relying on browser features like cookies. This combination of JSON communication,
token-based security, and stateless request handling creates an authentication flow that is efficient, scalable, and highly secure. Laravel's design ensures that API logins avoid session overhead completely, using tokens instead, which must be sent with every request like a digital key. This is why token authentication is central to stateless APIs. It replaces traditional sessions with a system that works reliably across devices, platforms, and cloud environments without storing user state on the server.
Laravel clearly separates how web routes and API routes handle authentication and responses. And this image highlights how token-based authentication replaces traditional session behavior in stateless API environments. When a mobile app, SPA, or any front-end client sends a login request, it communicates with an endpoint defined inside api.php, such as /API/login. Because this route belongs to the stateless API layer, Laravel does not use sessions or cookies to remember the user. Instead, the API controller validates the user's credentials, checks the database, and, if everything is correct, generates an access token. This token is returned in a JSON response and becomes the client's key for all future requests. Since the server does not store session information, every protected request must include this token through the authorization header. Laravel verifies the token on each call and only then grants access to routes that require authentication. This creates a predictable, secure flow where the server never relies on stored sessions. The token alone is proof of identity. The image also contrasts how responses differ between the web and API layers. Web routes return full HTML pages rendered with Blade templates and rely on sessions, cookies, and CSRF protection, making them ideal for traditional websites where the server keeps track of the user's login state. On the other hand, API routes return clean JSON objects that contain structured data, status messages, and tokens, designed specifically for apps and external systems that do not need HTML. This split allows Laravel to serve multiple types of clients from the same backend: a traditional website using Blade, a mobile app using JSON, and a JavaScript SPA using token-based authentication. With this architecture, the backend becomes a universal engine capable of producing both full pages and API responses depending on the request source. Token authentication fully replaces sessions in the API layer, ensuring that every request stays stateless while maintaining strong security. This makes api.php the perfect choice for modern applications where distributed systems, external integrations, and mobile-first designs rely on fast, predictable, and scalable communication.
When a user sends a request to a Laravel application, whether by typing a URL into the browser or calling an API endpoint, the request begins a carefully structured journey through the framework, and this image visualizes the entire behind-the-scenes flow. The moment the request arrives, it first enters the application through the public.index.php file, which acts as the single entry point for everything Laravel handles. From there, Laravel begins bootstrapping itself, loading the autoloader, configuration files, service providers, and environment settings, preparing the framework for the incoming request. Once bootstrapping is complete, control is handed over to the HTTP kernel, which manages all web-related requests and loads the global middleware stack. This middleware pipeline performs essential tasks before the request goes any further. It checks whether the application is in maintenance mode, validates request sizes, trims whitespace, converts empty strings to null values, and in the case of web routes, starts a session so Laravel can remember user data. After passing through the middleware layer, the request reaches the router dispatch stage, where Laravel begins scanning the route definitions inside web.php and api.php to find the correct match. Laravel checks the URL pattern, validates the HTTP method, determines whether any route parameters need to be applied, and finally decides whether the route should execute a controller method or a closure. If the matched route belongs to web.php, Laravel uses browser-oriented features like sessions, cookies, CSRF protection, and blade views to create a full HTML page. If the matched route belongs to api.php, Laravel processes it without sessions or cookies, applied through the stateless API middleware, and returns a clean JSON response. Once the controller or closure runs, Laravel prepares the final output and sends it back to the client, either as a rendered HTML page or a structured JSON payload. This entire flow demonstrates how Laravel transforms a simple browser or API request into a fully processed response, passing through initialization, middleware, routing, and response handling in a seamless and organized system.
In Laravel, every request from a browser, mobile application, or external service travels through a well-organized lifecycle before a response is returned, and this image visually maps out that journey from start to finish. Everything begins when a client makes a request, whether it's visiting a web page or calling an API endpoint. That request enters the application through the public/index.php file, which acts as Laravel's universal entry door. From there, Laravel begins its bootstrapping phase, loading essential components like configuration files, environment variables, and service providers that prepare the entire framework to handle the request. Once bootstrapping is complete, control passes to the HTTP kernel, which is responsible for managing all global and route-specific middleware. This middleware layer performs crucial tasks such as detecting trusted proxies, checking for maintenance mode, validating request sizes, and running authentication, rate limiting, verification, or session middleware depending on the type of request. At this stage, the application decides whether the incoming request should be processed by web.php, which handles HTML responses with sessions and cookies, or api.php, which handles stateless traffic returning lightweight JSON. After the routing layer identifies the correct route and middleware stack, Laravel hands the request to the appropriate controller. Inside the controller, the actual business logic takes place, validating incoming input, interacting with the database, processing data, and preparing the correct response. If the request came from a web route, Laravel returns a fully rendered HTML view using blade templates. If the request originated from an API route, Laravel instead sends back a structured JSON response. Once the response is generated, it travels back through Laravel's system and is returned to the client exactly in the format they expect, whether that is a styled web page or a clean JSON payload. This entire lifecycle, from request entry to response return, ensures that Laravel handles every interaction consistently, securely, and efficiently, whether it's powering a traditional website or a modern API-driven application.
Laravel route groups allow developers to apply shared settings to multiple routes at once, and this image illustrates how they simplify and organize large routing files. Instead of repeating the same prefix, middleware, or namespace on every individual route, Laravel lets you wrap several routes inside a group, and everything inside that group automatically inherits those shared properties. For example, an admin section of a website might use a common URL prefix like /admin. So instead of attaching /admin manually to every route, a group with a prefix is created, and Laravel automatically converts routes like /dashboard and /settings into /admin/dashboard and /admin/settings. This keeps the web.php file clean and prevents repetitive code. The same concept applies to namespaces for controllers. When all admin-related controllers live within the admin namespace, a route group can define that namespace once, allowing every route inside the group to reference controllers more cleanly without writing long paths. This makes the routing structure easier to read, easier to maintain, and far more consistent across the application. Route groups also allow shared middleware to be applied automatically. Middleware such as authentication, email verification, token enforcement, or API throttling can be attached to a group so that every route within it follows the same security and validation rules. This is especially useful in both web and API environments. In web.php, group routes often represent protected areas, like dashboards or account settings that require login sessions and HTML responses. In api.php, grouped routes commonly enforce token authentication, stateless behavior, and rate limiting, returning JSON output instead of blade views. The image demonstrates this by showing two typical flows. When a request hits /admin/dashboard, Laravel applies the admin prefix, runs the relevant middleware, such as authentication and verification, executes the controller logic, and finally returns a full HTML page. When a request hits something like /API/user/profile, the API group prefix is applied, token validation middleware runs, the controller processes the request, and a JSON response is returned. Route groups create a predictable structure, improve code readability, and make the entire routing layer scalable as the application grows. By centralizing shared behavior, they ensure that large applications remain organized and efficient without unnecessary duplication.
Laravel's resource routing provides one of the most powerful shortcuts in the entire routing system, allowing developers to generate a complete set of CRUD routes with a single line of code. Instead of manually writing separate routes for listing posts, creating new posts, editing them, updating them, and deleting them, the resource method automatically prepares all of these routes and maps each one to a corresponding controller method. When you write route resource, parentheses, posts, controller class, parentheses, Laravel instantly generates 7 fully structured routes: index, create, store, show, edit, update, and destroy. Each of these routes matches a standard HTTP method and URL pattern, forming a complete CRUD lifecycle for any resource. For example, the index method loads all posts, the create method displays a form for a new post, the store method saves the post to the database, the show method displays a specific post, the edit method loads the edit form, the update method saves changes, and the destroy method deletes the post. Because Laravel automatically binds these controller methods to the correct routes, you get a clean and standardized structure without manually writing dozens of route definitions. This automatic mapping not only keeps the routes file cleaner, but also ensures that every resource in your application follows the same predictable pattern, making large projects easier to navigate. The controller simply needs to include the standard method names, and Laravel handles the rest. This structure is ideal for admin panels, dashboards, content management systems, APIs, and any application that relies heavily on CRUD operations. It also accelerates development by reducing boilerplate code and letting developers focus directly on business logic instead of repetitive route definitions. Additionally, resource routing works beautifully in API environments, generating consistent JSON-based endpoints such as /API/posts with the same familiar CRUD flow. By relying on resource controllers, Laravel provides an auto-organized, scalable, and efficient routing system that keeps your codebase clean while delivering a powerful, production-ready workflow for managing data-driven features.
Laravel clearly separates two different types of routing through web.php and api.php, and this image highlights the conceptual difference between them by showing how each one is tailored to a specific kind of communication. Web.php is designed for browser-based interactions where the focus is on user experience, page rendering, and visual HTML output. These routes return fully rendered blade templates, rely on browser sessions to remember logged-in users, use cookies to store small pieces of data, and include CSRF protection for secure form submissions. This makes web.php perfect for pages like home screens, login pages, dashboards, settings panels, and any area where users interact through forms or navigate through a traditional website. On the other hand, api.php handles machine-to-machine communication, where the goal is efficient data delivery rather than rendering HTML. These routes always return JSON or other raw data formats and operate in a stateless environment, meaning no sessions, no cookies, and no browser-based memory. Every request must carry its own authentication credentials, such as API tokens or headers. Since API endpoints are often used by mobile applications, single-page apps built with React or Vue, and external third-party systems, they are typically rate-limited to protect the server from excessive traffic or abuse. While web routes focus on visuals, user flow, and HTML rendering, API routes focus on fast, structured data responses that can be consumed by apps, services, and automated systems. This clear separation ensures that Laravel handles both traditional websites and modern API-driven applications with optimal performance, security, and clarity.
This visual explains one of the most important decisions in Laravel routing: whether a route belongs in web.php or api.php. And it does so by focusing on a single guiding question: who is the final consumer of the route? If the route is meant for a human user who will interact through a browser, then it naturally belongs in web.php. These routes use sessions and cookies to remember things like logged-in users,
support CSRF protection for secure form submissions, and return full HTML pages built with Blade templates. Pages such as login screens, dashboards, settings, and any interface meant to be visually displayed to the user depend on this browser-friendly behavior, so Laravel handles them through the stateful environment provided by web.php. On the other hand, if the route is designed for another system, a mobile application, a single-page front-end like React or Vue, or any external automation, then the correct place is api.php. API routes are completely stateless, meaning every request must carry its own authentication through API keys, tokens, or header-based security. These routes do not store anything in sessions or cookies, and instead focus on returning clean, structured JSON data that machines can easily understand and process. This makes them ideal for mobile apps, modern JavaScript front-ends, and third-party integrations. In the simplest terms, if the response is a complete web page, it should go into web.php. But if the response is structured data meant for a device or system, it clearly belongs in api.php. This separation keeps your application organized, secure, and optimized for both human interaction and machine communication.